Chapter 6 of Army Life in a Black Regiment. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by FNH. Army Life in a Black Regiment by Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Chapter 6 A Night in the Water. Yes, that was a pleasant life on picket, in the delicious early summer of the South, and among the endless flowery forests of that blossoming isle. In retrospect, I seem to see myself adrift on a horse's back amid a sea of roses. The various outposts were within a 6-mile radius, and it was a long, delightful gallop, day and night. I have found a faint impression that the moon shone steadily every night for 2 months, and yet I remember certain periods of such dense darkness that in riding through the wood paths it was really unsafe to go beyond a walk, for a fear of branches above and roots below, and one of my officers was once shot at by a rebel scout who stood unperceived at his horse's bridle. To those doing outpost duty on an island, however large, the mainland has all the fascination of forbidden fruit, and on a scale bounded only by the horizon. Emerson says that every house looks ideal until we enter it, and it is certainly so, if it be just the other side of those hostile lines. Every grove in that blue distance appears enchanted ground, and yonder loitering gray-black, leading his horse to water in the furthest distance, makes one thrill with a desire to hail him, to shoot at him, to capture him, to do anything to bridge this inexorable dumb space that lies between. A boyish feeling, no doubt, and one that time diminishes without effacing, yet it is a feeling which lies at the bottom of many rash actions in war, and of some brilliant ones. For one, I could never quite outgrow it, though restricted by duty from doing many foolish things in consequence, and also restrained by reverence for certain confidential advisers whom I had always at hand, and who considered it their mission to keep me always on short rations of personal adventure. Indeed, most of that part of entertainment in the army devolves upon scouts detailed for the purpose, volunteer aides-de-camp, and newspaper reporters, other officers being expected to be about business more prosaic. All of the excitements of war are quadrupled by darkness, and as I rode along our outer lines at night, and watched the glimmering flames which at regular intervals starred the opposite river shore, the longing was irresistible to cross the barrier of dusk and see whether it were men or ghosts who hovered round those dying embers. I had yielded to these impulses in boat adventures by night, for it was a part of my instructions to obtain all possible information about the rebel outposts, and fascinating indeed it was to glide along noiselessly paddling with a dusky guide through the endless intricacies of those southern marshes, scaring the reed birds which wailed and fled away into the darkness, and penetrating several miles into the ulterior, between hostile fires where discovery might be death. Yet there were drawbacks as to these enterprises, since it is not easy for a boat to cross still water, even on the darkest night, without being seen by watchful eyes, and, moreover, the extremes of high and low tide transform so completely the whole condition of those rivers that it seems very nice calculation to do one's work at precisely the right tune. To vary the experiment, I had often thought of trying a personal reconnaissance by swimming at a certain point whenever circumstances should make it an object. The opportunity at last arrived, and I shall never forget the glee with which, after several postponements, I finally rode forth, a little before midnight, on a night which seemed made for the purpose. I had, of course, kept my own secret, and was entirely alone. The great southern fireflies were out, not haunting the low ground merely, like ours, but rising to the loftiest tree-tops with weird illumination, and anon hovering so low that my horse often stepped higher to avoid them. The dewy Cherokee roses brushed my face, the solemn chuck-will's widow croaked her incantation, and the rabbits raced phantom-like across the shadowy road. Slowly, in the darkness, I followed the well-known path to the spot where our most advanced outposts were stationed, holding a causeway which thrust itself out far across the separating river, thus fronting a similar causeway on the other side, while a channel of perhaps 300 yards, once traversed by a ferry-boat, rolled between. At low tide this channel was the whole river, and the broad oozy marshes on each side. At high tide the marshes were submerged, and the stream was a mile wide. This was the point which I had selected. To ascertain the numbers and position of the picket on the opposite causeway was my first object, as it was a matter on which no two of our officers agreed. To this point, therefore, I rode, and dismounting, after being duly challenged by the sentinel at the causeway head, walked down the long and lonely path. The tide was well up, though still on the flood, as I desired, and each visible tuft of marsh grass might, but for its motionlessness, have been a prowling boat. Dark as the night had appeared, the water was pale, smooth, and phosphorescent, and I remember that the phrase "wan water," so familiar in the Scottish ballads, struck me just then as peculiarly appropriate, though its real meaning is quite different. A gentle breeze, for which I had hoped for a ripple, had utterly died away, and it was a warm, breathless southern night. There was no sound but for the faint swash of the coming tide, the noises of the reed birds in the marshes, and the occasional leap of a fish, and it seemed to my overstrained ears as if every footstep of my own must be heard for miles. However, I could have no more postponements, and the thing must be tried now or never. Reaching the farther end of the causeway, I found my men couched like black statues behind the slight earthwork there constructed. I expected that my proposed immersion would rather bewilder them, but knew that they would say nothing as usual. As for the lieutenant on that post, he was a steady, matter-of-fact, perfectly disciplined Englishman, who wore a Crimean medal and never asked a superfluous question in his life. If I had casually remarked to him, "Mr. Hooper, the General has ordered me on a brief personal reconnaissance to the planet Jupiter, and I wish you to take care of my watch, lest it should be damaged by the precession of the equinoxes," he would have responded with a brief, "All right, sir," and a quick military gesture, and have put the thing in his pocket. As it was, I simply gave him the watch, and remarked that I was going for a swim. I do not remember ever to have experienced a greater sense of exhilaration than when I slipped noiselessly into that placid water, and struck out on the smooth, eddying current for the opposite shore. The night was so still and lovely, my black statues looked so dreamlike at their posts behind the low earthwork, the opposite arm of the causeway stretched so invitingly from the rebel main, the horizon glimmered so low around me, for it always appears lower to a swimmer than even to an oarsman, that I seemed floating in such concave globe, some magical crystal, of which I was the enchanted centre. With each little ripple of my steady progress, all things hovered and changed. The stars danced and nodded above. Where the stars ended, the great southern fireflies began, and closer than the fireflies, there clung round me a halo of phosphorescent sparkles from the soft salt water. Had I told any one of my purpose, I should have had warnings and remonstrances enough. The few negroes who did not believe in alligators believed in sharks. The sceptics as to sharks were orthodox in respect to alligators, while those who rejected both had private prejudices as to snapping turtles. The surgeon would have threatened intermittent fever, the first assistant rheumatism, and the second assistant congestive chills. Non-swimmers would have predicted exhaustion, and swimmers cramp, and all of this before coming within bullet range of any hostilities on the other shore. But I knew the folly of most alarms about reptiles and fishes. Man's imagination peoples the water with many things which do not belong there, or prefer to keep out of his way, if they do. Fevers and congestions were the surgeon's business, and I always kept people to their own department. Cramp and exhaustion were dangers I could measure, as I had often done. Bullets were a more substantial danger, and I must take the chance. If a loon could dive at the flash, why not I? If I were once ashore, I should have to cope with the rebels on their own ground, which they knew better than I. But the water was my ground, where I, too, had been at home from boyhood. I swam as swiftly and softly as I could, although it seemed as if the water never had been so still before. It appeared impossible that anything uncanny should hide beneath that lovely mirror, and yet when some floating wisp of reed suddenly coiled itself around my neck, or some unknown thing drifting deeper coldly touched my foot, it caused that undefinable shudder which every swimmer knows, and which especially comes over one at night. Sometimes a slight sip of brackish water would enter my lips, for I naturally tried to swim as low as possible, and then would follow a slight gasping and contest against